we noted that Roman order left the society shattered. I want to talk just briefly about this picture before we move on to the next slide. This is the Frankish king Charlemagne, and he is being proclaimed Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, Pope Leo II, right there. Pope Leo looks like he's struggling a bit to put the crown on the head of Charlemagne in a ceremony that was supposed to have some gravity to it. A couple of things that's interesting in that picture. The first off, it is the Pope in this picture who's putting the crown on the king. That's interesting and kind of important. So the question is, where does authority come? And is the church or the king more powerful? That's going to continue to kind of be a struggle. It's a theme in European history. And it kind of leads us today to this synthesis of separation of church and state. But at that point, it's clear that Pope Leo is putting the crown on the head of Charlemagne. A little interesting connection that 1,000 years later, a man named Napoleon Bonaparte is going to make himself the Emperor of France, and he's going to ask the Pope to get involved. But in this ceremony in 1800, Napoleon, well aware of history, takes the crown from the Pope's hands and puts it on his own head. But so there's an issue there, a little bit about where power and authority comes from. Charlemagne's empire lasted for a bit of time, but like most states in early Middle Ages, it didn't last very long. When he died, his grandsons divided it in pieces, and of course they would go to war with each other. And the idea of creating a Roman Empire, which always seemed to be a dream of Europeans after the fall of Rome, just seemed to be a kind of a pale comparison. Now, as we move ahead here, um, we know that Europe was on the edge of Afro-Eurasia. There's Asia, Africa, and Europe, and it was really poor and divided. If you wanted to go where the money was, if you wanted, and say 800 or 900 CE, if you want to know who were the leaders who are going to be making world history, Europe wouldn't be on your list. It was the 98-pound weakling on the beach. China, meanwhile, not by the 7th century, is rebuilding a powerful empire. It becomes the world's largest and most powerful state. And when Marco Polo gets there in the late 1200s, late 13th century, he's amazed by China during his 24-year stay there. And his story is not his stories. His stories basically captivated a growing number of European merchants. Marco Polo had never seen wealth like this. And one thing he brought back that the Chinese had the secret of how to burn rocks to create heat. What the Chinese were doing, in fact, was burning coal. And it's interesting that coal and gunpowder, too, which comes from China, would do a lot to fuel Europe's recovery and Europe's domination of the world that would come a few hundred years later. Paper doesn't hurt either. We'll talk about that later on. India had the wealthiest state society at that point. We know that people like Columbus were moved hoping to get to India and China because of its incredible wealth that compared to Europe. Indian textiles and spices were prized in Europe, and people of India were living much better than those in Europe. If there was a human development index, something around, say, in 1400 CE, the people of India and China would be living far better than the average person living in Europe. Meanwhile, the Arabs, who lived on the fringes of civilization itself, united together and formed one of the fastest rising global systems the world has ever seen. That under the Prophet Muhammad, a religion called Islam is going to excite and unite people of the Arab Middle East, and they'll extend it into the Persian Middle East, modern day Iran, and through North Africa. And this empire would eventually extend into Southeast Asia. So by 1100 CE, Muslims from all the way from West Africa to even the Philippines were coming to Mecca for their Hajj, their pilgrimage. They had to do once in their lifetime. The power of Islam, and it reached a very cosmopolitan by the time we're into the 12th and 13th century. Also, what really kind of smashed this is by 1250, the Mongols, who came from the fringes of civilization and the steppes of East Asia, are going to capture China and then move on to capture northern India, to capture Persia in the Middle East, to create the world's largest land empire that would actually extend from Syria to Japan. And that is a phenomenal experience. Although it didn't last very long, it would impact the histories of people as far afield as Russia, Iran, northern Vietnam, all the way into to Syria and Lebanon. So it was huge, and also to Poland, to the fringes of Western Christendom. We're going to see eventually how Western civilization's relative poverty and division would inspire its subsequent rise. Indeed, we'll see that competition between Europe's competing states, China would never break up into competing states for a long period of time, and the states that would divide and become rivals in Europe would inspire some of the risk taking and some of the innovation that would lead it to become a world leader, like exploration and then eventually industrialization. Okay, let's move ahead. So, point five, the period between the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the recovery of Europe in the Renaissance, which was starting around 1350, is called the Middle Ages. So that's what we're going to just generally look at. It's a time when Europe begins the period of recovery, essentially, though still a weak sister to the other civilizations of Afro-Eurasia. The word Middle Ages is oftentimes referred to as medieval. Medieval is a Latin term, it means middle time. But you got to consider people living in the Middle Ages did not think of themselves to being in the middle of anything. They were just living in their day. And most people in the Middle Ages had no idea what year it was. They didn't really know what year they were born. They knew when it was time to plant and when it was time to harvest. And life on earth itself, for the most part, was just a trying time, a trial for life in heaven. That this was a period of really very devout Christianity, even though maybe modern theologians would argue that it was riddled with superstition. Um, so this is a time when emerging medieval culture was a blend of Christian faith, and Christianity is the glue that kind of holds together medieval society. Whereas different states might argue on authority and go to war, they all assume some idea of the Christian faith, all believing the others had some incorrect idea of what Christianity is. The Germanic people that came in their languages, of course, which like include English, are going to be a big part of this. Germanic customs. So, if you think about this, for example, the days of our week come from Germanic Norse gods, like Woden's Day, which is today, is the day of Woden, King Odin. Thor's Day is Thursday. So many of those ideas come from the Germanic gods, although the months of the year all come from Roman mythology and Roman history. So anyhow, so we also see that Roman literacy and philosophy does not disappear, and much of it is preserved by the church. That the Roman church had used a lot of the Roman governing structure to manage its church. The Pope became the new emperor, the bishop became the new provincial governor, and the Roman Basilica became the medieval cathedral, as you see the picture there of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Over this period of time, 1,000 years, Western civilization struggled to maintain order, to fight off outside invaders, and to recover a level of interdependence and state control. Essentially, meaning that although it was through many competing states, we'll see the rise of the beginnings of England, the beginnings of France and Spain. It would be later before we would see societies states that would become Italy or Germany. But anyway, the ingredients for Western civilization's recovery and eventual global domination can be found during the struggle of the Middle Ages, this middle time, the beginning of trade networks, a continent that's hungry for trade, hungry for wealth. Because where the Europeans left Europe, they saw incredible things and with great envy hoped to try to obtain them somehow. A merchant does not leave port unless he finds there's something worth to trade. And I would say that it's in the competition and relative poverty of Europe's Middle Ages that draw it to some of the great adventures, some of the great enterprises that would lead Europe to eventually come to dominate the world. So we're going to have the quiz here after this. So just kind of a quick review. Do we understand that between 1500 and 1900 that the civilizations that we've studied, Greece and Rome, would come to dominate most of the world? Their presence was found about everywhere. We also know that the pattern of this domination is still very much present in us today. We could look at economic measures, political measures, and find that Western societies are either the envy of or part of different societies around the world. China, for example, which is emerging as the world's largest economy, but its per capita wealth is nowhere near that of the West, has used Western ideas of technology and Western ideas of economic organization and capitalism to rise up to do some amazing things in the last 30 years. The gaps between the richer and poorer countries have been narrowing, but yet the power and wealth of the West still remains. We know that the domination of the West and the Western idea of civilization, the Roman alphabet, Roman materialism, Roman science, would be a bit of a surprise to people living at the collapse of the Roman Empire, because Europe had emerged into into the medieval history as desperately poor, divided, and weak. We know that the period between the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the recovery of Europe and the Renaissance is known as the Middle Ages or Middle Time. Though it's not in the middle of anything, it did prepare Europe for a period of incredible growth and global penetration, which of course would spawn all different types of responses, whether it's racism or cultural superiority, ultranationalism, even world wars. The fruits of all of those poisons are part of the reflect part of the way of Europeans and people in the world coming to terms with Europe's rise. And of course, we know the answers in history. Okay, folks, you want to look over it. The presentation is listed here too in Google Classroom, so you can go back and look at it if you'd like, and then take the quiz. Wish you good luck.